So this webinar marks the culmination of work that began in earnest early in 2015 to review and revise our codes and standards. During the course of this project, we've carried out a public consultation, which elicited around 80 responses in total, all of which were largely positive. In December, the codes and the standards received parliamentary approval, and from the 3rd of April, we will begin inspecting against them. Our new suite comprises 7 codes rather than 9, as before. We no longer have a separate code on disposal, nor one on import and export, having instead included guidance on these topics in the individual codes, particularly the research and public display sector codes, where it's most relevant, so that the advice is tailored more to the needs of each sector. So Code A is the first of the suite of codes, and it's the overarching code. It sits alongside the others and includes information that anyone involved in licensed activities should read, regardless of their sector. The purpose of this webinar is to take you through the main changes to the consent code. Before I hand over to Vicky to take you through that code, I want to remind you of the status of these codes. So here is an extract from Part 2 of the Human Tissue Act, where provisions in relation to the codes of practice are set out. The HTA may, in carrying out its functions with respect to licences, take into account any relevant observance of or failure to observe a code of practice when dealing with a matter dealt with in a code. So these are important resources for you to draw upon, giving practical guidance and laying down the standards expected in relation to the conduct of licensed activities. They also form the basis of our superintendence of compliance with licensed activities.
Hello everybody, my name's Vicky Marshment, and I'll be taking you through the next set of slides we've got. In terms of introducing this code, we thought it'd be useful to give a little bit of background on how we got to where we are today. We had an initial set of codes to support establishments as we were establishing ourselves as an organisation back in 2005-06. And then in 2009, we launched what was effectively the last set of parliamentary approved codes of practice. So that was a fully worked up set of codes that were published in 2009. When we were starting the project to undergo a wholesale refresh of these codes of practice back in 2014 and thinking about the approach we would take, we did make some small updates to the code to make sure that they were reflecting the current legislation and where we were. So the versions that are currently up on our website have a note saying that they were refreshed, I think is probably the best way of putting it, in 2014. We're now moving on to the set that we're speaking to now, including this Code A, which is the overarching code. There has been a good deal of change since 2009. We've had the new EU directive on organ donation and transplantation. We're also about to go into consultation on new EU directives on imported material in the human application sector in particular, and the codes that need to be applied for the movement of material across Europe and outside of Europe for that matter, again in relation to the human application sector. We've had new legislation brought in Wales, particularly in relation to deceased organ donation. So the opt-out legislation went live in Wales just over a year ago, at the beginning of December 2015, and the HTA were required under that legislation to produce a code of practice to support it. That's available on our website, but hasn't been included in the refresh project here as it's only a year or so old. In terms of what's going on in the sectors we regulate, as we would expect, there's been a great deal of innovation and new development within the sectors. And there's also been a great deal of innovation and development around the sectors we regulate. So we face questions about the role social media has in organ donation, and also the more commercial aspects of the establishments that we work with, and in terms of work with human tissue as well. So a good deal of change, and it seemed like the relevant time to start looking at the codes again. We also have a good deal more experience of regulation. We're quite a lot older as an organisation, and hopefully a little bit wiser. We've been out to more establishments and we have a clearer picture of what's going on, so it's enabled us to be able to reflect our learnings as well that we've gained over the period since 2009. There have been very small changes to the Human Tissue Act 2004, which have been changes that have been brought about by other pieces of legislation, but there haven't been any significant changes to the Human Tissue Act 2004. So really, while the codes have been refreshed and updated, the cornerstone of our legislation hasn't changed. So as I say, it's a good time to work with those we regulate and other stakeholders to update our codes of practice, and that's what we've been doing over an 18-month to 2-year period. Just to give you a little bit more information on Code A, it is our overarching code and it's our key guidance document, particularly for those that are working under the Human Tissue Act. It's something that we would advise all of those that are working under that legislation to read as a starting point before launching off to the sector-specific codes or guidance documents. It's divided into 3 sections. We have our guiding principles, and then the fundamental guiding principle, and then the guidance and statutory requirements relating to consent. We provide generic information that applies across all of our sectors. So what is appropriate consent under the Act, what constitutes valid consent, and we reference there both common law and mental capacity legislation. The scope of consent, so when consent is required, and for that matter when it isn't required, and then how to go about dealing with any conditions that are placed on consent, the duration of consent, and when it might be appropriate to seek either enduring consent and give information about the withdrawal of consent. So it brings together all the generic information that we think that those working in establishments need to know about consent and explains the legal concept. It provides, as I say, a launch pad to the sector-specific codes, and what we've done in this revision based on our knowledge of how those within establishments are using codes, but also from having conversations when we conducted our consultation exercise, and also in the feedback that we received during that period, that we have removed sector-specific guidance from this code and made sure that it's dealt with in those sector-specific codes. In terms of key changes in this document from the previous version, we have our new guiding principles, which Caroline will speak about shortly. We've restructured this document and hopefully that makes it more logical and accessible to those using it. We've taken the feedback that you gave us and made sure that that's reflected. We provided more clarity on the legal position in relation to donated material, particularly in relation to organ donation, and this sits alongside public guidance that we issued 18 months ago on consent and organ donation and the legal position. We've also done some work to redefine the use of the terms must and should, which are absolutely key within this document, and we'll speak about them just now. So when the word must appears in the code, it applies to all legal requirements derived from primary and secondary legislation. So there's a couple of examples given here. So it's that perhaps the legal requirement to hold a license to store human tissue for a scheduled purpose, and the conditions that are imposed on any license, and also the requirements set out in any directions issued by the HTA. So we make clear that they must be followed, and it also applies to the duty to abide by the HTA's licensing standards, which are included in the sector-specific codes where relevant. We use should where we're providing advice on how to meet these requirements. Hopefully this is helpful to those working under the legislation, but that's not to say as time goes on that there might not be other ways that people go about meeting the standards and requirements, and we're always glad to have feedback on that. If you have been working on an alternative way to meet the standards and you think that's something that there would be value in sharing with others within the sector, do let us know. We like to keep up to date, and we are the repository to share information as well. In terms of what's missing from this code that was in the previous code, a good chunk of sector-specific information has come out. As I say, that was based on feedback we'd received. So, for example, references to consent to post-mortem examination, the detail of that sits within the post-mortem code. In terms of exemptions for criminal justice purposes, we found that when we get questions in this area, that often it's bespoke advice and guidance that's needed, and therefore we would if there are any questions in that area, we would push and support people to contact us directly with the particulars of the case or the circumstances. And in terms of the exceptions in relation to research, again, they're specified in the Research Code of Practice. The section on imported material that did sit in the consent code has now been moved into the appropriate codes, so primarily the Public Display Code and the Research Code. In terms of consent and DNA, we have no regulatory remit in this area, but we do provide guidance, and that's provided in frequently asked questions on the website, which we feel is the more appropriate place to have it rather than within the codes of practice themselves. Reference to the Polking Hall guidelines on the use of fetal tissue for research. Again, there was some confusion as to why this was included here. We will be making sure that as the codes are launched at the beginning of April, we provide some information on where the Polking Hall guidelines have been superseded by the Human Tissue Act and where the Polking Hall guidelines still exist and are still in place. So we'll pop that table up on the website, and if you have any questions in that area, do feel free to contact us directly. But again, it felt more appropriate to deal with that by way of separate guidance rather than within the statutory code of practice. Good practice examples, we know they're something that are appreciated and used by establishments, but we felt that they would be more appropriate within the sector code, so we were able to give more specific good practice examples. So they haven't disappeared completely, they've just found new homes in the sector codes. In terms of what we've added, the new guiding principles, as I've mentioned, and we'll go on to a little bit more detail on those in a moment. We've added a statement about our remit and its limitations, very much a tone of the period between 2009 and the current day has been an increasing number of questions posed to us as a regulator for areas that aren't strictly within our remit. For example, we've published guidance on fetal remains. We've currently been asked questions about cryopreservation of whole bodies as well. So what we've made clear is the edge of our remit and our standing and the limitations within that, but also given a nod to the fact that there will be occasions when we're providing advice and guidance that is outside of our remit and the limitations that we place on that. That's on page 3. On page 12, we provide information that is specific to what the law says on individuals placing conditions on their consent. This is something that we originally had inquiries about from the organ donation and transplantation sector, but may well be relevant elsewhere as well. So hopefully provide some clarity about the steps that you may need to take if an individual is seeking to place conditions on the consent they're giving to an activity underneath the Human Tissue Act. We make reference to marketing and advertising requirements as well. That's on page 11. And again, this I think gives a nod to the changes that we've seen in the nature of the establishments that we regulate, and making sure that we're very clear that when marketing and advertising material is in place, that it provides the information and accurate information people need in order to provide valid consent. In terms of information on charging, this is towards the back of the Code of Practice on page 35, and this is something that was very much prompted by inquiries and questions we've had from the public over a number of years about making sure that it really is clear that when there is a charging element that may be in place for material, that's made sure it's made clear to those that are providing consent to donate their material, so they know what's likely to happen and whether charging is going to be involved. I'm going to hand over now to Caroline to speak through the guiding principles and finish off this presentation.
Thanks, Vicky. So the HTA's approach is founded on 4 guiding principles which underpin our regulation, our codes of practice and our licensing standards. And these principles should inform the actions of anyone engaged in a licensed activity for storing or using human tissue, and indeed the work of the HTA. Although they've always been at the centre of our work, we've not stated them explicitly in our codes before, and a great deal of thought went into how they should be articulated. Each sector-specific code contains advice on what the guiding principles mean for that particular sector. For example, in relation to the research sector, the principles translate into actions which ensure that potential donors are given the information they need to make the best decisions requiring their consent, It's also incumbent on regulated organisations in that sector to manage human material in accordance with expressed wishes for removing, storing, using and disposing of material properly and respectfully. In the post-mortem sector, there's more emphasis placed on the dignity of the deceased, so bodies of the deceased and tissue taken from the deceased should be treated with respect in an environment that's safe and secure. The dignity of the deceased should be maintained at all times, and the needs of the bereaved should be met with care and sensitivity and their wishes fulfilled where possible. In the public display sector, they're very much the same, the emphasis of course being on the arrangements for display of material. So Code A sets out the intentions behind each principle, so what it is intended to achieve, and of course our licensing standards reflect these guiding principles. The first guiding principle establishes consent as the primary consideration when using human tissue. It means that human tissues or bodies of the deceased should be used in accordance with the expressed wishes of donors or their relatives. Donors and their relatives should be given the information they need to be able to make a decision that's right for them, and those seeking consent should do so with sensitivity and an appreciation of the particular circumstances in each case. Our consent standards for each sector are designed to ensure that appropriate procedures are in place to govern the consent process, that consent is sought by people who are trained to undertake this task, and that valid consent is given in line with statutory and regulatory requirements. So the consent standards very much reflect this first guiding principle. The second principle is dignity. It recognises that human bodies and tissue must be treated in an appropriate manner and afforded respect. So the dignity of the donor should be respected at all times, and bodies and tissue should be protected from harm. The privacy of donors should be respected and maintained. The disposal of tissue should be managed sensitively, and the method of disposal should be appropriate to the nature of the material. Where it's from the deceased, the wishes of the deceased or those of their family should be respected. And where human tissue is importers should endeavour to ensure that it's sourced from a country that has an appropriate ethical and legal framework. The inclusion of reference to imported material is most relevant to the research sector. The import of tissue for transplantation is subject to rigorous requirements under EU legislation. So the Research Code contains more guidance, whilst recognising that the legal provisions of the HTA Act don't apply to imported material. For those of you working in licensed establishments, you'll be able to see how the second principle underpins our standards on governance and quality and premises and facilities, in particular in relation to traceability, disposal and storage. The third principle, quality, places emphasis on the training and competence of staff, including compliance with relevant professional guidance, the condition of premises and the governance of activity. It too seeks to ensure the safe storage and use of human tissue and the importance of respecting the individual's right to privacy and confidentiality. It's reflected in many of our licensing standards across the four groups of consent, governance and quality, traceability and premises, facilities and equipment. And finally, principle 4 on honesty and openness. This principle has several strands. So firstly, communication with the donor or a person from whom consent is being sought should be open, honest, clear and objective. Serious incidents involving human bodies and tissue should be subject to rigorous investigation to ensure that lessons are learned and the risk of recurrence is minimised. We've included that establishments should adopt a policy of candour and transparency when dealing with serious incidents, as well as meeting their other statutory and professional duties of candour where appropriate. And also, we've concluded that discussions about medical investigations or treatment should be kept entirely separate from discussions relating to consent for use of tissue for scheduled purposes. So a donor is absolutely clear about what they're consenting to. And finally, that there should be clarity about arrangements for charging and reimbursement, again, which is most relevant to the research sector. Detailed practical guidance on the application of these four guiding principles in the areas of your work is available in the HTA's sector-specific codes and licensing standards. I hope you'll be able to see how they translate from the consent code A into those sector-specific codes. And if anybody has any particular questions about any of those guiding principles, then please do get in touch with us.